Čuli ste probleme koje su nam, da ne ponavljam. Pa, šta bih vam rekao? Ja sam, ime mi je Miodrag Živković, meštanin sela Slatine. Zanimanje metalostrugar. Malo poljoprivredu, malo ja radim nešto u struci, tu imam u garaži jednu mašinu. Sada trenutno imam primanje od 14.000 dinara, to je nekih 110 evra možda mesečno. Mogu vam reći da smo u mnogo nezavidnoj situaciji. Kinezi su normalno ovde došli za profitu. Nisu Kinezi ovde došli da bi bilo dobro meni i mojim komšijama tu i ovde. Ne, došli su da rade i da zarade ljudi, da odnesu to što mogu da ponesu. Nastali od otvaranjem rudnika ovde, oduzeta nam je imovina. Oni su povećali proizvodnju. Samim tim su povećali i aerozagađenje. Srčane bolesti, plusne bolesti, karcinomi, kardiovaskularne bolesti, šta sve još stoji tamo. Sve je to prouzrokovano štetnim sastojcima iz borskog tima. Ne znam i na kraju krajeva mene ne dotiče to ništa, niti me dotiče politika na nivou naše, ni velja, nevolja, ni najviše bih volio da ne znam ni ko je predsjednik. Ne. Ko nam nije dozvolio? Naša vlast. Jednostavno su nas stavili u drugi plan, dali su to Kinezima.
Where does a story begin? It's always a difficult question. In this ancient part of Southeast Europe, it is almost impossible to answer. Does this story begin with the fall of Yugoslavia, with the wars of the 1990s, or the recent rise of populist politics? Does it begin with the European Union's inability to incorporate the Balkans? Or with the rise of new global partners that don't ask many questions when doing business? Is it a story that starts with what has already happened in East Asia, in Africa, in Latin America? Or with what's to come in the future, as new powers encroach closer and closer upon the old? Where does a story begin? For the purposes of this particular story, we begin in Bor, an old mining town in Eastern Serbia, where China has invested billions of dollars in one of Europe's most polluted cities.
Pa igrala se deca, tu su se igrala, tu su kao mala su bili sa babom. Tu smo mi živjeli i ja i moji preci više od 100 godina. Posla gdje sam radio u RTB-u, radio sam, obrađivao sam imanje, kao ja i moja cela porodica od ovog imanja. Za bolje nismo znali i nije ni trebalo bolje. Da će na ovim prostorima da se otvori rudnik. Ja kažem, ja moje imanje neću da prodam na dozvoljenoj bazi, zato što sutra će da nađe neko taj papir gdje sam ja i će kaže, evo, deda je dao imanje za bagatelu. Pa da, svi su prodali, ti neće da prodaš i sad su ti oni problem što došli tu. Vrag odneo šalu i kaže, mora, kaže, da prodamo. Oni su uveli eksproprijaciju, nisu mi platili ništa, uzeli su. Sad neće da nas primi na razgovor. Sad nas svi okrenuli leđa. Jer ovu našu državu, Srbiju, sve se prodaje.
Bor is a very depressed town in southern Serbia, which has extraordinary reserves of copper and gold.
In 1897, Serbian industrialists backed by French capital discovered copper ore in a region then called Tilvaroš. Ever since, Bor has been a mining town, drawing men and women from around Serbia with the promise of employment.
Da smo mi, građani Bora, ljudi koji leže na zlatu, a ujutru se bude u blatu.
In recent years, as production and profits plummeted, Serbia sought an international partner to take on the mine. It struggled to find one.
And the smelter was going bankrupt. The Chinese came in, saved it from bankruptcy, saved the jobs, and have taken over the whole area, and they are basically running the Bor municipality at the moment.
In 2018, Zijin Mining, a Chinese state-owned company, offered to invest over $1.2 billion in the mine, in exchange for majority ownership and control.
Zato što su kineske fabrike zaštićene kao beli medvedi. Zaštićene su bilateralnim sporazumom, međudržavnim, da je iznad domaćih zakona. Inspektori srpski ove države ne smeju ni da uđu u borsku fabriku.
Zijin Mining is the dominant power in that part of Serbia. They don't have to worry about pesky bureaucrats in Brussels raising questions. They certainly don't have to worry about pesky Serbian officials raising questions. No one has any real idea what they're doing.
Bilo je možda po 10-ak, po 15-ak, možda i više detonacije na dan. Desilo se to što su počeli da miniraju, da kopaju, da buše, da ovo. Počeli su prvo prozori da popucaju, pa zidovi, pa...
Upon gaining control, Zijin Mining began to ramp up production and expand the mine into surrounding villages.
To se postepeno, svakim danom, kad god su Kinezi minirali, onda se... I ovdje gledam sve manje i manje vode u ovom bunaru.
Na ovoj teritoriji došlo je do proširenja rudnika. Došlo je do rušenja, znači meštani sela Krivelj sa kompletne teritorije Krivelja.
4 hektara tamo. I na kraju oni ušli i uzeli to kao eksproprijacija. I rušili i po jatu, i voćke, i dinar nisu dali, ni dan danas. To je sve njihovo. Kaže da je tako im odobrila vlada Republike Srbije.
Inače, na ovom groblju ima preko 3000 grobnih mesta. Kompanija zahteva da se preseli groblje zbog eksploatacije samog rudnika na toj teritoriji. Mi smatramo dedove, očeve, majke, braću, sestara sahranjeni na tom groblju, tako da...
Oni mi kažu da ima više vlade. Ja pismena nisam, niti se bavim politikom. Ja poštujem ko je na vlasti. Mene zanima moj život, znači ja sam jadna i bedna. Uzeo si mi imanje, nemam penziju, kako da živim? Kako da živim?
Jednostavno da se to obruši, pa da li smo u sobi, da li smo bilo gde, to će jednog dana da klone, da padne, da potone, da jednostavno, da ne stanemo mi, a Kinezi će da ostanu.
As mining activities have increased in Bor, so has the impact on the region's environment.
Bor je devastiran grad u svakom slučaju, u svakom pogledu. Ono što je još više i još gore je što se tu nalazi teški metali kao što je arsen, čija prekoračenja dostižu i 50 puta od limita godišnjih.
Grad Bor nikada nije bio vazdušna banja, zato što je rudarski industrijski grad. Imali smo uvek zagađenje, ali nikada ovako. Tu su u vazduhu, vi imate trenutno, dišete i sumpor dioksid, dišete teške metale, dišete PM čestice koje se lepe za vaša pluća i koje više nikada neće moći da se izvuku iz vaših pluća.
Samo su to te otpadne vode i ovo. U ovim otpadnim vodama od sumpor dioksida, arsena, nikla, kadmijuma, olova, verovatno i žive. Mislim da se živa čak i ne meri u ovim mernim stanicama. Ceo periodični sistem hemijskih elemenata. Zdrav razum koji može da odobri proizvodnju i koja je to proizvodnja koja može da opravda trovanje stanovništva.
The rationale for the Chinese investment is that they take care of their environment and they are moving the dirty technology from China abroad. In China, they are heavily investing in green technology, while in Serbia, they are transferring dirty technology, and in every aspect of what they do, they are polluting Serbian environment.
I to sve relativno mladi ljudi. Borsko groblje je prepuno, naše groblje je prepuno. Umiru jednostavno od posledica zagađenja.
Ja predlažem da nas Vučić malo da nas postroji i da nas postrelja bolje.
Molim vas, pozdravite predsjednika Srpske napredne stranke i našeg kandidata za predsjednika Srbije, Aleksandra Vučića.
Aleksandar Vučić has served as president of Serbia since 2017. He was Serbia's prime minister for 4 years before that. Vučić's rise began during the regime of Slobodan Milošević, where he served as Minister of Information through years of bloody conflict.
Pa vi bombardujte, ubijte jednog Srbina, mi ćemo 100 muslimana.
He has since tried to distance himself from the hard right, shifting to a more populist approach.
Ali ono što je za mene najvažnije, gradit ćemo fabrike i gradit ćemo fabrike i gradit ćemo nove fabrike, vraćat ćemo naše ljude iz inostranstva.
His the leader, provider, has accomplished impression that he is the most important provider of everything: salaries, pocket money for students and teenagers, and it is a very strong impression.
Nema nazad, nema u prošlost, idemo napred, idemo u budućnost, Beograd ide napred, Srbija ide napred, živela Srbija!
Nema politike, nema ideologije. Zvanična politika jednog čoveka koji je sve i svja u Srbiji. Dakle, ne postoje zakoni, ne postoji ustav, ne postoji podela vlasti, ne postoji nezavisno pravosuđe, ne postoji nezavisno tužilaštvo i sudstvo, ne postoje nezavisni državni organi, ne postoji sistem.
I can tell many negative things about him, but you cannot discharge some facts. No, he's loved by a portion of the population. He's really loved.
Koliko vidim, brine o narodu. Pa malo da penzije, pa koliko god da.
Mlad čovek, uporan, bori se za Srbiju, za nas penzionere.
I Vučićevi glasači, kojih ima i sa levice i sa desnice, oni podržavaju njega i njegovu ličnu vlast.
Privlači puno stranih investicija, što automatski daje mladim ljudima šansu da u ovoj zemlji žive i da rade, da od svog rada žive.
Da, jeste, podržavam ga.
Volite ga? Ste zadovoljni? Jesmo.
Is it a democracy? They have elections, they count the votes reasonably fairly, and the person who gets the most votes wins. But the structure around that, those mechanics, is beyond deeply flawed.
U Srbiji nema demokratije. Ovde ne postoji mogućnost pravih izbora. Ljudi koji rade po javnim preduzećima, a sad već i po privatnim, su pod neviđenim pritiskom da moraju da glasaju, da moraju nađu 5 do 40 svojih prijatelja koji će takođe glasati.
Over 3 million people, which is majority of Serbian people, are basically living very close to poverty.
There is no real economic life except state service. It is a matter of life and death being in a right party.
Under Vučić, any opposition has faced increased pressure from human rights protesters,
jaja na mural, nakon čega je usledilo takvo brutalno obrušavanje. Svi su imali neke vetrovke, kape, kačkete.
to opposition candidates.
Gađali životinjom. Taj slučaj kada su me u februaru mesecu na konferenciji za novinare na Otvorenom.
To environmental whistleblowers.
To je bilo eliminacija mene da više to ne radi, da ne skrećem pažnju. Naravno,
I was punished because I was loud enough to say this is not normal. Why you are doing this?
Meanwhile, President Vučić has consolidated control over the country's media.
People are not informed. They don't know it. Close to 70% of the Serbian population is informed only by the public TV service under control of the Vučić government. And then it's easy to manipulate after because people just don't know.
Režimski mediji prenose režimski narativ.
When he starts to talk about journalists as a threat, all of his followers are doing the same.
Prvo, finansijski lome. Ako to ne uspeju, onda prelaze na druge vrste pritisaka, a dešava se da dođe i do fizičkih napada i drugih vrsta ataka na nezavisne novinare.
Life here seems like deep, quiet ocean, but under the water situation is completely different. Under the water are sharks ready to bite.
China deals with governments and societies as it finds them. If you have a high standard rule of law country and a Chinese corporation comes in, it's going to behave at least in a more rule-based way. On the other hand, if there is no rule of law and it is only corrupt, they're perfectly capable of dealing with that. Much of our commentary about China and its behavior in the world puts it in an ideological frame. I would say it's at least as much an issue of pragmatism.
The Chinese banks and construction companies and resource companies involved in all this, they expect to make money. They are a major importer of many different types of commodities. Mostly sell it back in China and they're going to make a profit.
But also small and poor countries want to get rich. And the operative question from their viewpoint is, who's going to help us do that?
Chinese say they're going to build a road, and a year later you have a road. You know, and a Western institution like the World Bank says they're going to build a road. It might take 10 years. Maybe it'll never happen.
If you look at the way the U.S. has defined development and so on, it's building institutions for good governance. Well, frankly, when you're poor, roads probably appeal to you more than institutions.
Beginning in the 21st century, the Chinese government and Chinese state-owned enterprises rapidly increased investment and trade with a series of African countries.
Africa, of course, is the continent of the future. It has all the resources that the world needs to survive. Oil, natural gas, forests, when we're talking about green energy, water, about hydroelectric power. China needs resources. China needs its own sphere of influence. They don't put a lot of preconditions. They don't ask questions about human rights. They don't ask questions about freedom of speech and all that kind of democracy speak.
China itself is not a democracy. The Chinese realize once you introduce those criteria, projects are not going to happen. That defeats the Chinese purpose of trying to use these projects to build economic ties and also to strengthen political ties in order to build China's strategic influence.
The Chinese do not need to feel comfortable. They roll with the punches, they go along with the place. They accept it as is and then take advantage of it.
For Latin America, the access to increased Chinese financing and trade sparked a period of high growth.
China just came in as a player with significant amounts of cash rather than promises.
A key driver, a key objective from the Chinese perspective is to secure the kind of natural resources that's necessary for supporting and sustaining domestic economic growth. And of course, these resources are not exactly or readily available in China.
Energy, hydrocarbons, minerals, grains, meat, lithium, copper, iron ore, orange, banana, you name it. Latin America has a lot to offer China.
Now, in the Balkans, China has expanded this model into Europe.
What alternatives do the recipient countries have? So if it's not Chinese money, then there's no money.
A key question emerges. Is this just normal large country behavior, or is it something more concerning?
The Chinese are not unique when it comes to exploiting a place and taking advantage of it. The Chinese use the same model everybody else. The model is exploitation, the model of taking resources, and the model it calls for maximization of profit.
The West has been in Latin America since the 16th century. Portugal, Spain, and later the Dutch, the English, the French, the Danes, the Swedes.
It's interesting how Westerners look at it as an aggressive move when China invests in Italy and Greece, right? But the United States doesn't give a second thought to if it wants to invest in Vietnam.
So whether it's a Chinese company or a US company or a French company, that is the game.
Yet, access to Chinese capital can sustain governments that don't follow the democratic norms the European Union and the United States claim to support.
Chinese financing has to make it a little bit more sustainable for these authoritarian countries to continue to be authoritarian countries.
This also buys China a lot of influence on the ground. If you think about it, if you owe China $1 billion US, then when China says that, well, you need to vote a certain way on the issue of Taiwan, as the United Nations, you are going to. So this economic influence does translate into political influence.
If we're irrelevant economically to much of the world of the future, then, what's our political power going to be? And I think you have to assume if you increase the capability of people who do not recognize norms, they're not going to recognize some norms you care a lot about. Democracy is not a permanent condition.
Chinese investments in Africa, Latin America, or the Balkans are most often not gifts. The development projects are structured as loans. These can be very expensive, especially for small countries.
And that puts that country in a subservient position where Beijing either has the capability to seize critical infrastructure or critical asset as a collateral, or perhaps where this does imply always a hypothetical risk of what the experts call debt trap diplomacy.
Montenegro, a country on Serbia's southwest border, managed to quickly become heavily indebted to China. Now, 8 years after taking on substantial loans for infrastructure projects, the country has little to show for it.
In Montenegro, where the previous government decided to take loans for a $900 million road. That road so far has barely been built. It's a beautiful state-of-the-art project, but it goes from absolutely nowhere to nowhere. It's nearly bankrupted the government of Montenegro, and the terms of that loan are a state secret.
In 2014 we get the credits which is around 1 billion of euro. In that moment that was more than 25, maybe around 30% of GDP. 1 billion euro is the huge money for this country. One of the most expensive highways in the world, only for 43 kilometers, from nowhere to nowhere.
All the Western institutions believe that the project was unviable from the financial and monetary standpoint. So what happened? They went to Beijing, who was willing both to finance through the credit line the construction of this project and to put its own construction companies to work.
In 2022, an initial portion of the highway finally opened, but the debt to China grows.
To je kad te velike projekte vode neodgovorne vlade. Po mom računu blizu nekih 90 do 100 miliona. I ako mi imamo 10 do 15 miliona prihoda godišnje, ostatak se mora finansirati iz budžeta.
It's never really going to pay itself, because that's what the studies have shown. But if we don't continue it, then we're going to have an even bigger problem. The contract clearly says that they could estimate whether we can or we cannot pay. If we cannot pay the debt, then China could ask for part of our territory. It's really unclear, because it's not written anywhere, how they can decide which part of territory. Who's going to decide how much that territory is worth? Of course, they would take something strategically important. They wouldn't take the mountains. I mean, they would take something that makes political sense, economic sense. And we saw in other countries that those are mainly ports or mines and natural resources that the country has.
No one knows the terms of the deal and, more importantly, who got kickbacks for that deal.
Kompletna dokumentacija je bila proglašena državnom tajnom. To je savršen način da se sakrije sve što treba da se sakrije.
S druge strane, u ovaj posao su ušle brojne firme iz Crne Gore koji predstavljaju direktnu vezu sa prethodnom vladom, odnosno političarima koji su povezani sa tim firmama, i to automatski znači da jačate određene firme. Svi oni koji su učesnici u kreiranju takvog jednog projekta su sebe vrlo dobro zaštitili, jer je donešen zakon o autoputu koji u suštini štiti sve one koji su na taj način zamislili taj projekat.
Ja sam Ivan Brajović, predsjednik sam Socijaldemokrata Crne Gore, druge najjače opozicione partije danas u Skupštini Crne Gore. Bio sam ministar koji je potpisao ugovor o projektovanju i izgradnji sa kineskim partnerima. A apsolutno odbijam pri sklapanju ugovora, nikakve korupcije nije bilo, jer ugovor je, i to je izuzetno važan autoput, jer Crna Gora je ovako bez modernih puteva i bez dobrih željeznica u stvari potpuno aviodestinacija. Morate da vidite i što sve to omogućava kad je u pitanju razvoja ekonomskih potencijala. Oni su sa stanovišta finansiranja omogućili najjeftiniju izgradnju i dali najbolje uslove, finansijske uslove za izvođenje.
Western banks, they were willing to discuss offering loans, but there were so many strings attached to the loan, and their main interest was, is this an economically viable project? Which it clearly isn't. But for the Chinese company, what they care about is just having a contract. They're not bothered about whether they produce something that's useful to anyone.
They say that EU, it's not so dedicated, it's not so fast in moving in some projects. They see that the politicians which are not so strong in the principles, and they use the situation.
China just exploited the opportunity, the political and geostrategic opportunity they saw in a corrupted government.
The flaunting of environmental safety, the loans without public oversight, the opaque labor standards. These shortcuts would be less likely if the Balkan countries were part of the European Union. Not so long ago, the idea of Western Balkan countries joining the EU did not seem so remote.
Serbia begins its negotiations to join the European Union this month, kicking off years of talks aimed at bringing thousands of pieces of national law and legislation into line with EU standards.
At that time, the enthusiasm was present on both sides.
It seems that Serbia have set membership of the European Union as its ultimate political and economic goal.
Back then, Serbia's #1 cheerleader to join the EU was a young Prime Minister, Alexander Vučić.
Alexander Vučić, you say that Serbia deserves those talks. Explain to me why.
People are ready for changes in our country. And we're going to show to the whole world, to the European Union, that we are part of Europe, that we can do in the same way, in the same manner as you do.
But the timing was all wrong. Over the next decade, the EU lurched from one crisis to the next. A financial crisis, an immigration crisis, Brexit, anti-EU populism. All forces served to limit the EU's appetite for expansion.
It was 2003 where the EU promised the countries of the Western Balkans that doors are open. For nearly 2 decades, we are listening to the same mantra.
It is really becoming a little bit boring because conditions are new and there is always something extra you should do for full membership.
I think that the EU was not interested in the region for a long time.
European Commission presidential candidate Jean-Claude Juncker has said it's time for the European Union to take a break from its expansion plans. Sometimes in Europe we have to think before we take action.
Nachdenken in Europa, bevor wir handeln.
And that was the gun that kick-started a lack of interest for any serious reforms.
A narrative emerged in the Balkans that they were being led on.
Consider a Turkish example. Turks have been waiting for 40 years to become members and they gave up. They don't care anymore.
After 15 years of discussions, Macedonia even changed its name to North Macedonia to settle a dispute with Greece and speed up the process of joining the EU. They're still waiting.
President Vučić said that openly. He said, I don't trust the EU. You see what they did to Macedonia? These poor guys, they changed their names and they haven't started to negotiate still.
Meanwhile, Serbia also cooled on the idea of joining the EU, as this would require significant reforms.
The EU standards mean clean water, fresh air. Acceding to the EU requires full implementation of the rule of law, implementation of the honest approach to the fight against organized crime, against corruption. The incumbent government decided that the costs of the EU accession might be too high.
A vacuum emerged in the region. Balkan leaders found a new partner willing to fill it.
Naša se Kina koja ne postavlja političke uslove na prvi pogled i koja bez velikih problema odobrava finansijske kredite i to vlada u Beogradu lako akumulira I prihvata.
It's the perfect deal. I get the money, I don't have to answer too many questions. I can then go to my voters and say I've boosted economic growth. And that's, I think, the biggest danger of this whole situation is the Chinese approach to not just business, politics, but life are being transplanted into Europe.
As the Chinese and Serbian governments get closer, the cooperation has extended beyond copper and highways.
Here you can see these cameras that are implemented in this system. They can also be used for face recognition, and there is a 360 cameras that can move and capture faces.
Over the last decade in China, Beijing has implemented a far-reaching, technically advanced public surveillance system. Smart cameras that can recognize biometrics, track citizen movement, and even detect attitudes have blanketed Chinese cities.
If somebody wants to buy surveillance equipment and find out how to surveil society to maximize control, they'll export the systems that'll let you do that.
Beginning in 2019, the Serbian government began installing smart cameras produced by Huawei all across Belgrade.
They're not just regular CCTV cameras, they do have smart capabilities. They can detect a face, they can detect a vehicle, they can detect license plates.
This means that not just the criminals, but every citizen could be surveilled, followed the whole time, and their personal data being stored in some data centers or command centers of police. We are quite afraid what our government can do.
Especially to activists, investigative journalists, and similar categories of people who do have a very prominent public role in social life.
We are seeing how this camera is being used in China by the Chinese authority to control their population or to suppress restive minorities. So this does tells us something about the risk of China's national security model can be replicated in places like Serbia.
The cameras remain, but the Serbian government contends that their smart functions are not being used.
Belgrade being the first city on European soil to implement such a system does say something about the context in which the system has been set up. Both for the Chinese partners and for the government here, it was a good opportunity to test out the system on European soil.
Back in Bor, the Chinese investments bring concerns, but they also bring jobs.
Idemo na radno mesto, da ne zakasnimo.
Sasha Radulovic works at Zijin Mining.
Druga smena.
He is critical of the mine's impact on his village, but he needs the job.
Nešto za klopu. Idemo na posao.
Inače, imam radni staž 35 godina radnog staža u toj kompaniji. Znači, radio sam ranije dok je bilo RTB Bor, znači državno. Dosta je usavršavano u pogledu mehanizacije, došle su nove mašine, novi pogoni su se izgradili. Uslovi su se dosta promenili dolaskom kompanije. Lični dohodak, ali sve to u nekoj granici.
As a common citizen, you see only good things from Chinese investments. It is difficult to estimate, is it better to have some degree of pollution or not to have factory at all?
And so the Chinese offer of infrastructure and investment and trade with these countries is very attractive.
Svima je lepo kod Kineza, ali niko ne osjeća ono što mi osjećamo, mislim, u njihovom okruženju.
Nezaposlena ćerka, nezaposlena unuka, on u Zijin Koper radi, unuk, a i sin radi, ali on, pa šta da radiš, gde da ideš, ima 50 godine, gde da ideš?
Nije nam baš prijatno što nam sin radi tamo, ali šta da radi kod Kineza? Pa po neki put jeste, sin po neki put jeste zadovoljan, po neki put nije, ali šta da radimo? Rekao, Abre, žali se Kinezima tamo, što se žališ meni?
By early 2022, election season in Serbia is in full swing. The opposition boycotted the previous election. This time, it is competing in full force, with Marinika Tepic as its candidate for prime minister.
Kako izgleda istina u Srbiji? Bila je motivisana time da želimo cijelom svetu da pokažemo.
It is an election the opposition will almost certainly lose.
It's nearly 100% sure that Vučić will get another mandate. Elections are not the proof that the democracy exists.
In war, beneath the smog of the mines, environmental activist Irena Živković is running for office as part of the opposition.
Od 2015. godine pokušavamo da na sve moguće načine spasimo naš grad i da spasimo i nas i našu decu i naše zdravlje. Dobar dan, izvolite. Dobar dan. Izvolite. Jel mislite da možemo nekad da rešimo ovo zagađenje u gradu?
It is not an easy task.
Da pročitate malo o ekologiji, malo kako ne moraju da nas toliko baš truju. Jeste čuli da je država napravila istraživanje i da su objavili da u Boru posljednje 2 godine umiru mnogo ljudi od raka? A mogu da rade i bez toga.
Elections are stolen by the system before the elections. You have all those working in the public institutions who are blackmailed to vote for the ruling party, otherwise they will lose the job. In fact, the majority of people are not voting for President Vučić or his progressive party. They're voting for their own existence.
The dance of democracy continues. The participants play their roles in anticipation of a predetermined outcome. The impact of Chinese investment fades to the background. Yet, as China expands into the Balkans, concerns extend beyond environment, beyond a lack of transparency, and to the very labor standards Europe has championed.
2019. Linglong kao najveća investicija je došla da napravi najveću fabriku guma u ovom delu Evrope. Planirana proizvodnja je nekih 14 miliona pneumatika godišnje, odnosno 40.000 pneumatika dnevno. 80 miliona subvencija, obezbedila im je 100 hektara najboljeg i najkvalitetnijeg zemljišta potpuno besplatno. Ne na 10, 20 ili 99 godina, nego je to preneto u trajno vlasništvo, znači govorimo o najkvalitetnijoj. Radnici koje njihove fabrike dovedu rade 5 godina ovde bez poštovanja zakona Republike Srbije, već radi isključivo po zakonima Narodne Republike Kine.
Linglong is a state within the state. Linglong is a product of one contract signed between our and the Chinese government. And we are not allowed to find out the details of that contract. No, Linglong does not follow Serbian laws at all.
By arranging such deals, Serbia has to engage with Chinese construction companies, Chinese workers.
Jedan jako mali broj ljudi iz Srbije danas radi na izgradnji Linglonga. Mnogo veći broj ljudi dolazi sa fabrikom iz azijskih zemalja.
They were not aware that they're going to work with a Chinese company. They thought it's going to be a German company. That's what they told us.
Yes, they were tricked to come here and they're extremely poor. For me, that's the example of the human trafficking.
Most of the foreign workers live in these facilities on the outskirts of the factory. But in late 2019, local journalist Ivana Gordic made a startling discovery.
If you don't go there, you don't know that that part of the industrial zone exists.
Vietnamese workers hidden, living off-site in deplorable conditions.
They were not allowed to go out, and their poor life was here. People were in those 2 small houses where shelter for 750 people from Vietnam and China, and they had only that one yellow generator for all of them.
It was 2 water heaters for 430 workers, half a liter per person, I would say, actually, of hot water. Without electricity, without heating, without safe drinking water, without sanitation.
They had only 2 bathrooms for 600 people. They had no sewage, and all that water, you had a small lake of that dirty water.
It's the accommodation where you would not really put animals in.
No water, no electricity.
Do you have your passport with you?
No. I don't have anything with me.
You don't have basic things?
Yeah, basics. Basic. No electric, no water. It's small water, small electric, and no medicine, and the health, everything not good. Only work.
They are supposed to work 10 to 11 hours a day, so actually only 4 days off. On top of that, the problem is that they were not provided with documentation, labor permit. There was no health insurance for them, there was no COVID protection at all, and there was literally no one that they would be able to speak to about all these problems.
We saw their contracts, and it is correct that they have $600 or $700 or $800 per month. That's true. But they do not receive that money because their managers, they always find some mistake. So every day they took a part of their salary. We found the people who were not paid for 4 months. They are very poor, and they came here looking for a better life, but they were tricked. Unfortunately, here in my country, that's why I am so bitter. For me, it's worse than a prison. For me, it's concentration camp.
Now that specific camp is closed, but other questions about working conditions at the Linglong tire factory remain unanswered.
谢谢，我感谢塞尔维亚对我们中国很好，对我们中国的对我们中国同胞在这里，有什么事情他们都帮助我们，非常感谢。我在这里快2年了，很高兴，在这里好比在中国一样，就跟自己的家乡一样，生活各方面都很好。谢谢塞尔维亚的人民 ，Thank you。
What China does in Serbia is a test for Europe. And Serbia is witnessing dirty technologies coming, construction projects without tenders. Serbia is also the first country which is implementing the Chinese face recognition technology. These are all warning signs that what can happen if Europe doesn't care more about Serbia.
On April 3, 2022, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić won re-election in a landslide, securing nearly 60% of the vote.
Takođe, za nas je veliko pitanje šta je to što želimo sa svojom zemljom da uradimo u narednom periodu. Hoćemo li da nastavimo njenu modernizaciju? Hoćemo li da vodimo računa o tome kolike će nam biti strane direktne investicije. I ako mogu samo da vas zamolim nešto, vi meni da pokvarite raspoloženje večeras, to je nemoguće.
Where does the story end? Does it end with election results? The completion of a tire factory? The creation of a new mine? The transition to a new power? Perhaps this is a story under construction, with no clear ending in sight. But for the purposes of this story, the end is the beginning. In Bor, a small mining town in eastern Serbia.
Pamtim da je moj otac odlaskom u penziju dobio neki vid otpremnine, to se tako zove kod nas, za 40 godina rada u RTB-u, u rudniku. Za tu otpremninu on je mogao da kupi jedan lanac za motornu testeru koji sad košta 20 €. Znači, nagrada njegova za 40 godina rada u rudniku je bila tada, zbog te inflacije, sadašnjih 20 €. Supruga je nezaposlena, sin je završio sad školu i on je trenutno bez posla. Vidjet ćemo, verovatno će biti nekih mogućnosti da se zaposli u RTB-u, mada se ja plašim i za to radno mesto što se tiče ekologije. Ne može ni jedna plata da nadomesti zdravlje ljudi i čovjek zaradi pare da bi te pare posle potrošio da se leči, to nije posao.